The notification landed on my phone at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in March. When I was already awake, had been awake since 3 a.m., my mind running through spreadsheets and scenarios that would never materialize. My heart rate stayed steady as I read it. That was the strangest part. I'd always imagined that moment would arrive with some kind of internal earthquake, a visceral shock that would buckle my knees or close my throat. Instead, I felt my shoulders drop, felt something like relief flood through my chest, which made me angrier than anything else could have. At 52 years old, I'd been fired via email from a company that had consumed the last 23 years of my life, and my dominant emotion was relief that the uncertainty was finally over. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in the darkness of my Baltimore townhouse, reading words that essentially said I was no longer valuable, and somewhere in that dark moment, I laughed. Not a joyful laugh. The kind of laugh that comes when you realize you've misunderstood the fundamental nature of something for longer than most people stay married. I had 48 hours to turn in my laptop, access badge, and any company materials I'd accumulated over 2 decades. The email was signed by someone named Margaret Chun from the HR department, a woman whose name I didn't recognize and whose face I would never know because we lived in an era where termination had been streamlined into bureaucratic efficiency. There was a number to call. There was a website to visit. There was severance, not insignificant, but not enough, never enough. The money wouldn't last 2 years the way I spent it. I did the math immediately. I've always been good at math. Mathematics is the language of men who've learned not to trust words. And I've been speaking it fluently since I was 29 years old and watched my father lose everything in a housing development that went sideways. My hands were shaking now, which was strange because the fear hadn't arrived yet. Just the physical response of my aging body catching up to an emotional reality I hadn't fully processed. I thought about calling someone. Who does a man of 52 call at 6:47 a.m. when his life implodes? Not his ex-wife we hadn't spoken in 4 years except through texts about logistics involving our son Michael, who was now 27 and building software in San Francisco and had made it abundantly clear he didn't need anything from either of us except distance. Not his mother, she was 91 now, living in an assisted facility in Ohio, and this news would terrify her more than it would help. Not any of his friends, because men of a certain age understand that admitting vulnerability isn't the same as connection. So I sat there on the edge of my bed, my body slowly responding to what my mind already knew. My entire identity, the thing I had spent the majority of my existence constructing and defending and proving valuable, had been discarded like a document scheduled for permanent deletion. I got up. I made coffee. I sat in the kitchen in the pre-dawn darkness with my aging hands wrapped around the mug and watched the city come alive through the window. It was March, so the morning was cold but not punishing, that particular Baltimore cold that exists in the space between winter and spring when nothing is certain yet. I thought about the job in ways I hadn't allowed myself to think about it while I still had it. I'd been Senior Vice President of Operations for Ashford Manufacturing, a position I'd climbed toward for 10 years, stepping carefully around the politics and the personalities and the unspoken rules about who could be trusted and who was waiting for weakness. When I finally got the promotion 3 years ago, promoted by a CEO named David Rothstein, who I'd worked under for most of my tenure and who had always seemed to appreciate my methodical approach to problem solving, I'd felt a completeness I hadn't experienced since my son was born. The job had finally become what I'd always believed it could be, except it hadn't. Within months, I began noticing patterns that didn't make sense. Decisions that contradicted the strategies we'd spent years developing. Money moving through channels that seemed circuitous when direct paths existed. And me, consistently consulted for opinions, then just as consistently overruled by people with far less experience and far more caution. 3 years. 1,095 days. That's how long I'd lasted as Senior Vice President of Operations. I'd lasted in every other position for longer. I'd been a manager for 7 years before my first director promotion. I'd stayed in that role for 9 years. But the higher I climbed, the more unstable everything seemed to become. Like the upper atmosphere of the company was thin and cold and didn't sustain life in the way the lower levels did. I understood in the kitchen that morning that I'd been systematically dismantled, but I couldn't figure out the architecture of my own destruction. That bothered me more than the actual termination. I've spent my entire professional life believing that if you're careful enough, methodical enough, aware enough, you can anticipate the ways things fall apart. I'd failed at anticipation. I'd failed at reading the signals that were apparently screaming. By 7 a.m., I'd made the decision to do what I'd learned to do in crisis situations, nothing immediate. I called the severance number and left a voicemail saying I'd be in touch. I forwarded my critical emails to my personal account, which was technically against company policy, but firing someone via email seemed to negate certain professional courtesies. I showered. I dressed in actual clothes instead of the sweatpants and t-shirt I'd been living in for a month. I drove to the Ashford Manufacturing office in Canton, sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes, then drove home again without going inside. The action of going through the motions of normalcy was somehow more exhausting than the crisis itself. The real horror of losing your job when you're 52 is not the initial shock. It's the realization that your narrative has ended and you have no idea what the next chapter is supposed to be. It's the creeping awareness that the skills you developed, the ability to manage spreadsheets and personalities, and expectations have been rendered less valuable by the simple fact of your age. When you're young and you lose a job, it's a setback. When you're 52, it's an ending. People don't say that, of course. They say things like, "This opens doors, and now you can explore new possibilities." What? Their thinking is, he's probably done. I could read it in the faces of people I'd called over the following week, colleagues who'd made it clear in previous conversations that my door was always open if I needed anything, who suddenly weren't returning messages. I understood their silence. I'd been that person once, the one who understood that proximity to failure is contagious and that generosity toward the falling was a luxury only the secure could afford. What I didn't understand, what I spent the entire first week trying to comprehend, was why the fall had come so suddenly. I'd been high enough in the organization to have access to board reports. I'd seen the company's financials. Ashford Manufacturing wasn't struggling. We'd posted a 7% revenue increase the previous year. We'd secured 2 major contracts with automotive suppliers that were supposed to generate $10 million in new revenue over 3 years. The company was stable. Except, somewhere in the way I'd been maneuvered out, I began to suspect that my understanding of the company's stability was incomplete. The thought started small, just a nagging recognition that certain meetings had happened without me. Certain communications had been routed around my department. Certain decisions had been made without the operational input that was theoretically my responsibility to provide. On Friday of that first week without employment, I drove to the office and parked in a spot I hadn't used in months. I didn't go inside. I sat with the car running and watched employees I'd worked alongside for years move through the lobby, each of them carrying the careful knowledge that I was gone and they remained. Survival isn't noble, it's just what happens when you understand that. Expressing loyalty to someone who's been terminated is equivalent to expressing disloyalty to the organization that fired them. I saw Thomas Patterson walking toward the building, his posture perfect, his leather briefcase probably containing documents about my replacement or my successor or whatever the position was being called now. Thomas had been my director of logistics, someone I'd brought into the company specifically because he was meticulous and honorable and reminded me of who I'd been when I was his age. We'd had coffee 17 times over the 3 years I was VP. I'd mentored him through a failed project, helped him navigate a complicated relationship with one of the CFO's nephews, and recommended him for his director position. Seeing him pretend not to see my car felt like confirmation that I'd been worse at reading people than I'd been at reading organizational patterns. I drove away without confronting him. At 52, I was learning that dignity isn't always compatible with understanding. Sometimes you have to leave things unclear because the clarity would hurt more than the mystery. The severance package included 3 months of Cobra health insurance, a modest exit bonus $45,000, and a signed non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from discussing anything I'd observed about the company's operations with anyone outside of legal counsel. That last part should have struck me as unusual. Most severance agreements included standard non-competes and confidentiality clauses, but this one was extensive in ways that seemed disproportionate to someone my level. It specifically prohibited discussion of operational methodologies, personnel decisions, strategic planning initiatives, and financial management practices. The language was aggressive. It was the language of someone protecting something. I signed it anyway because I needed the money and because I hadn't yet learned the lessons that were waiting for me in the weeks ahead. By the second week, the reality of unemployment had calcified into something almost manageable. I'd set up a routine coffee at 6:30 a.m., gym by 7:15, back home by 8:45, then nothing. The nothing was the hardest part. I'd spent the last 23 years filling hours with email and meetings and the small dramas that constitute professional life. Without that structure, I had access to the kind of time that only unemployed middle-aged men understand. It's not peaceful. It's a vacuum that fills itself with doubt and with the conviction that you've wasted years doing something that could be discarded so easily. I started sleeping better, which was itself a kind of betrayal. My body had wanted out of that job for longer than my mind had admitted it. I was doing research on severance law, a rabbit hole that accomplished nothing except to reinforce that my options were limited, when Michael called on a Tuesday afternoon. Not texted, called. The phone ringing with my son's voice attached to it was unusual enough that I answered on the first ring, expecting crisis accident, illness, some kind of external emergency that had necessitated voice contact rather than our standard asynchronous text communication. "Dad," he said, and his voice carried that particular quality that meant he knew something and wasn't sure if I already knew it. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I'm good. I'm Sarah's pregnant. Actually, that's not why I'm calling, but that's happening. The reason I'm calling is because my friend David, the one who works in recruiting for tech companies, he heard through someone at Salesforce that you got terminated from Ashford." I sat down. I didn't want to be standing for this conversation. "I got a severance package. It's fine." "It's fine?" "Dad, you've been at that company since I was basically born." "Exactly. Maybe it was time for a change." That's not what a severance package means. A severance package means they fired you and they gave you money so you wouldn't sue them. Michael was 27 and he had the particular confidence of someone who'd entered the job market after the digital revolution had reorganized how work actually functioned. He believed that your job could change monthly, that loyalty was something companies dispensed when it benefited their bottom line, and that his generation's relationship to employment was categorically different from mine. He was right about that last part. The difference was that his generation's knowledge wasn't. Wrapped in the particular shame that men of my age carried about being employees, we still believed, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise, that if you were good enough, careful enough, and committed enough, you could build a stable foundation. We'd been lied to, but we believed the lie so deeply that its disproof felt personal. "Your friend David can tell whoever at Salesforce that I'm exploring my options," I said. "Come to San Francisco," Michael said. "Seriously. You could stay with Sarah and me for a few months. There's a ton of consulting work for operations people here. You could probably double your previous salary." I felt something close to tenderness listening to him propose. A future that didn't involve me sitting in my townhouse watching hours dissolve. I appreciate that. Let me think about it. Don't think about it too long, he said, which contained some kind of advice I wasn't quite tracking until later, when I realized it meant your situation is worse than you're processing. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen and looked at my phone. Sarah was pregnant. Michael was going to be a father. The world was continuing to produce new humans, new possibilities, and I was 52 years old and unemployed and still living in the same house I'd moved into when Michael was 3. Some things hadn't changed in 30 years except my capacity to understand them differently. I went to the gym that evening and stayed 2 hours longer than usual. I lifted weights that probably weren't safe at my age, ran on the treadmill until my knees told me to stop, and sat in the hot tub trying not to think about how I defined my value for the last 23 years and how little remains of you when that definition is removed. An older man, probably early 60s, with the bearing of someone who'd already worked through the particular humiliation of aging, sat down next to me. "You look like you're processing something," he said. "Job?" I said. "Got let go." He nodded like this was information he'd been waiting for. "First time?" "Yeah. It happens faster the second time," he said. "That's the thing nobody tells you. The first time, you think you did something wrong. After the second time, you start to understand it's just the system working exactly as designed." "How many times?" "4, he said. Aerospace engineer. Made good money, then they discovered they could make better money without me. Now I consult. It's less stable, but it's more honest." I wanted to ask him if the honesty made it better, but I suspected the answer was, not really, just different. Instead, I sat in the hot tub with this stranger and accepted a piece of wisdom I didn't want to know was true, that displacement was becoming the primary feature of professional life rather than the exception to it. By the 3rd week, I'd started reading about Ashford Manufacturing obsessively. Not from the company website or the press releases, those were propaganda designed for shareholders and stakeholders. I was reading industry reports, competitor analyses, regulatory filings. I was looking for the shape of what had happened to me, trying to understand if my termination was personal or structural or some combination of the two that I couldn't yet perceive. What I found was patterns. Ashford had gone through 3 CEO changes in the last 8 years. They divested from their original manufacturing focus and become more of an operations consulting firm that handled manufacturing for other companies. They'd moved toward contract work rather than long-term relationships, which made sense financially but reduced stability. And they'd been gradually replacing experienced personnel with younger employees who were cheaper to employ and less likely to question structural changes. I was part of a wave. There was no personal vendetta. My destruction was simply strategic efficiency. The understanding should have been comforting. Instead, it was terrifying. I'd spent 23 years becoming increasingly specialized in systems that were being systematically dismantled, and I'd been too deep in the daily operations to notice the architecture of my own obsolescence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I got up at 2 a.m. and went to my garage. I still kept a box there that I hadn't opened in probably a decade. It contained documents from my career, performance reviews from my first job as an operations manager at 30 years old, commendations from the first company I worked for, photographs from the early days of my tenure at Ashford. I opened a review from 2003, when I was still young enough to believe that consistent excellence would protect me. The review said, "Harrison represents the model of a reliable operator. His methodical approach to problem solving makes him invaluable to our team." I'd been 30 years old and I'd taken that statement as confirmation that I'd chosen correctly. The subtext I was only now understanding was, you are useful as long as you remain predictable, inexpensive, and unlikely to demand more than the organization is willing to provide. I called Thomas Patterson at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. I hadn't planned to. I'd driven past the Ashford building twice without going in. I drafted and deleted 17 emails to various former colleagues. But I called Thomas directly to his cell phone, which I still had from the rare occasions when we texted about scheduling. "Harrison," he said, and I could hear the careful friendliness mixed with wariness. "Hey, can we get coffee?" I said. "Somewhere not near the office." There was a pause that contained everything I needed to know about what he was thinking. Then he said, "Yeah, of course." "Where?" We met at a coffee shop in Fells Point that neither of us had ever been to before, which meant it existed outside of the geography of our previous relationship. Thomas looked older than I'd expected. He was probably 38 or 39, but something in his posture suggested weight he hadn't been carrying 3 weeks ago. We ordered coffee and sat at a table near the window where we could see the harbor, and I watched him decide what he was allowed to tell me. "I'm not here to ask you to violate your NDA," I said, which was a lie. "I just wanted to understand what happened." "I can't really talk about," he started. "I'm not asking you to violate anything," I interrupted, which was still a lie. "I'm just asking as a person who worked with you and who apparently wasn't doing something right. What did I miss?" Thomas looked at me for a long moment. "They were looking to restructure," he said finally. "David and Margaret and the board. They'd decided that the operational infrastructure was too expensive, that they could consolidate some of the roles and outsource the rest. Why didn't I see it coming?" "Because you weren't supposed to," Thomas said, and there was something like pity in his voice. "That was part of the plan. If they'd signaled it, you would have organized resistance. You would have documented reasons why the restructure was inefficient. You would have used your access and knowledge to complicate things. So they kept you in the dark until they were ready to move." I heard what he wasn't saying. I had been expendable, and my elimination needed to be clean and final. "Did you vote for this?" "I wasn't in those rooms," he said. "I'm a director. That conversation was above my pay grade." "But you knew." "I suspected," he said. "I found out for certain the day before they let you go. Rebecca came to me and said they were making the move that day." Rebecca Matthews was the chief financial officer, someone I'd worked with for the entire 3 years I was VP, someone who'd sat next to me in quarterly board meetings and reviewed operational budgets with me every month, someone I believed I was aligned with. "Rebecca pushed this?" "I don't know if she pushed it or if she just accepted it," Thomas said. "I don't know the internal politics well enough to tell you which people wanted this and which people just went along with it. That's above my level. I just know it happened, and you're not here anymore, and I'm supposedly getting some of your responsibilities, which is going to double my workload while they replace your salary with software and outsourced consulting." I felt something crack inside my chest, which was the moment I realized I'd been carrying hope. Not hope that I could get my job back. I hadn't articulated that hope, but it was there underneath the surface of my actions. I'd been hoping that there was something I'd done wrong that I could understand and correct, that there was a logical architecture to my destruction that I could study and learn from. What Thomas was telling me was that my destruction had been logical and strategic and utterly impersonal. It had nothing to do with my competence or my value or my ability to do the job. It had to do with the company's decision that my salary, my experience, and my organizational memory were liabilities rather than assets. "What happens to the operations department?" I asked. "They're bringing in a consulting firm," Thomas said. "Apparently they've already signed a contract. It becomes the responsibility of people who are less invested and who can be replaced the moment the project is complete. It's more cost efficient." After Thomas left, both of us pretending the conversation had been casual, both of us knowing it had been something closer to a confession, I drove to the harbor and parked. I sat in my car and watched boats move through the water, and I tried to understand the particular mathematics of my replacement. If Ashford had gone through the cost analysis that had led to my termination, they would have had to make calculations. My annual salary and benefits, $240,000, my pension contributions, $60,000 annually, my consulting travel budget, $40,000. against the cost of hiring 3 junior staff members at lower salaries and outsourcing specialized work to consulting firms. The math probably made sense on paper. The math probably looked efficient. The math didn't account for institutional knowledge or the subtle ways that experience makes systems run smoothly. But I understood that my accounting and their accounting operated in fundamentally different universes. What I couldn't understand was why Rebecca, who I'd worked with closely and who I'd believed understood the value of continuity and institutional knowledge, would have been part of the decision to eliminate me. It felt personal in a way that Thomas's account didn't fully explain. Or maybe I was still looking for the kind of personal quality that would give the destruction meaning. Maybe I wanted to believe that I'd been targeted because of something specific, rather than removed because I was inefficient. Both explanations hurt, but one at least offered the possibility that I could have predicted and prevented it. Over the next week, I became obsessed with understanding Rebecca's role. I didn't plan for this to happen. I'd set a goal of moving forward, of exploring options, of doing what Michael had suggested and researching consulting opportunities in San Francisco. But the mystery of Rebecca's involvement kept pulling at me like a current. We'd had dozens of conversations over 3 years. We'd worked together on budget problems, staffing solutions, strategic decisions. We'd sat next to each other at social events, had dinner together once with our spouses when I was still married, had confided in each other about work frustrations and personal struggles. And then she'd apparently participated in my elimination without warning, without explanation, without any indication that things had shifted between us. I called her office. She was unavailable. I sent an email saying I'd like to discuss my transition and asked if she had time for coffee. She replied the next day, "Harrison, I appreciate your professional approach to this transition. Unfortunately, I'm in meetings for the foreseeable future. I wish you the very best." The formality of the language was its own kind of confirmation. She wasn't going to talk to me. She'd already written our history into a different narrative. What I did then was something I hadn't done before and wouldn't have believed I was capable of doing. I started investigating. It began small. I wrote down everything I could remember about meetings in the weeks leading up to my termination. I accessed the company's public sec filings and read the board minutes. I called a lawyer who specialized in employment law and asked what grounds I might have for challenging the termination. The lawyer explained that at-will employment means employers can terminate for almost any reason as long as it doesn't violate specific protected categories: age, disability, race, gender, religion. My age could potentially be a factor, but proving age discrimination is nearly impossible when the company has executed multiple terminations across age groups. There was no case. There was no recourse. There was just the fact of my removal and the ongoing mystery of how and why it had happened. By the 4th week of unemployment, I was driving past the Ashford building 3 times a week. I wasn't going inside. I was just parking and watching people enter and exit, trying to see if patterns would reveal themselves. I told myself I was being rational, gathering information. What I was actually doing was trying to reconstruct a narrative that would give my destruction meaning. I was hunting for evidence of a conspiracy that would prove I hadn't simply been deemed obsolete. I'd been systematically targeted. That's when I noticed something odd. Rebecca's car was in the parking lot more frequently than usual. She was coming in very early and staying very late. The pattern went on for a week. Then, one evening around 7 p.m., she emerged from the building with David Rothstein, the CEO, and they stood talking in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes. Their body language suggested disagreement. David's hand was on Rebecca's arm in a way that might have been reassuring or might have been something else. After they parted, Rebecca drove away and David went back into the building, and I realized I'd crossed into territory I didn't recognize. I was a man with time and access, and I was using both to reconstruct fragments of an organizational drama that was no longer mine to understand. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I called a former colleague named Marcus who still worked in the operations department, someone I'd been friendly with over the years but not close to. I told him I was considering my options and wanted to catch up, wanted to hear how things were progressing under the new structure. He hesitated, which told me he'd probably been warned, but he agreed to meet for lunch the following Tuesday. Marcus showed up looking exhausted. He was probably 45, which meant he'd grown up in the same era I had, but had made different choices about how to navigate corporate hierarchies. He'd remained flexible. He'd been willing to move roles laterally when companies were reorganized. He hadn't invested as much of his identity in climbing upward. The wisdom of that approach had become increasingly obvious over the years. "How is it?" I asked him. "The restructure?" "It's a mess," he said. "We're trying to transition systems to the consulting firm, but they don't understand the legacy infrastructure. Everything's broken. David's furious. Margaret's pretending it's fine. Rebecca's basically checked out." "Checked out?" Marcus looked around the restaurant to ensure no one was nearby. "David fired his second executive a month ago. Did you know that?" I didn't. "Who?" "Richard, from the Atlanta office. Fired him too. Didn't give him severance. Tried to say he was terminated for cause, but then walked it back when Richard's lawyer got involved. There was a settlement. Rebecca was involved in that decision too, and from what I understand, she didn't want it to go that way. She wanted them to handle it differently. Something crystallized then. Rebecca hadn't just been party to my elimination. She'd been involved in multiple terminations that seemed strategically similar, but that apparently had different outcomes. And she was apparently conflicted about these decisions in a way that David and Margaret weren't. That distinction mattered. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Marcus. "Because I'm tired," he said. "Because I've been watching David and Margaret systematically eliminate institutional knowledge and replace it with cheaper and less capable alternatives. Because I think someone should understand what's happening. Because you have the knowledge of how this place functioned and the standing to question whether something illegal or unethical is occurring." He paused. "Also because I'm concerned about my own position and I want to know if anyone's tracking the pattern." "Is there a pattern?" I asked. "Legally, I mean. Is there something illegal in what they're doing?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "Firing people seems to be legal. But firing people selectively in ways that target specific ages, specific salaries, specific knowledge bases, I don't know if that rises to the level of age discrimination or if it's just smart financial management." Over. The following week, I couldn't stop thinking about the distinction Marcus had outlined. I researched age discrimination law more extensively. I learned about disparate impact theory, the principle that policies that appear neutral but have a discriminatory effect might constitute illegal discrimination. Ashford had eliminated me and apparently fired or pushed out other operations staff. All of them were older. All of them had high salaries. All of them had been replaced with cheaper alternatives or outsourcing. The pattern seemed evident. But proving pattern isn't the same as proving discrimination, and I wasn't sure I wanted to pursue that path anyway. What I wanted was understanding. I wanted to know why Rebecca, specifically, had participated in my elimination when she seemed to have conflicts about similar decisions involving other people. I wanted to understand the architecture of power within the company that made that difference. And if I'm being honest, I wanted something approximating acknowledgement that what had happened to me wasn't inevitable or impersonal. It was a choice that someone had made, and I wanted to understand that choice. On a Thursday evening in early April, 6 weeks after my termination, I drove to the Ashford building and parked in my old spot out of habit. The security guard recognized me and waved me in without asking for my access badge, which no longer functioned anyway. The office was mostly empty, just a few people at their desks, the way offices look after hours, slightly sad and exposed. I went to Rebecca's office. She was still there alone, looking at her computer screen. "Hello, Harrison," she said, and her voice carried a tone I couldn't identify. Sadness, maybe. Guilt, possibly. Or just surprise at seeing someone whose existence had supposedly been concluded. I closed her office door behind me. "Why don't we talk about what actually happened?" I said. Rebecca turned her chair to face me. "We can't. The NDA." "I don't care about the NDA right now," I said. "I care about understanding. You and I worked together for 3 years. You sat next to me in meetings. You drank coffee with me. You attended my birthday party. And then you participated in eliminating me without warning, without any conversation, without giving me any indication that things had shifted." Rebecca stood up. "What do you want me to tell you, Harrison? I want you to tell me why. I want to understand what changed. I want to know if I did something that necessitated my removal or if I was simply determined to be inefficient." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating, deciding what she could say without violating her legal obligations, what she could acknowledge without creating liability for herself or the company. "The decision was made above my level," she said finally. "I was consulted because I'm the CFO and any restructuring involves financial implications. But I didn't advocate for your termination specifically. Did you advocate against it?" She sat back down. "I had concerns." "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that were noted and then overridden," she said. David had already decided. The board had already approved the approach. My concerns about institutional knowledge and the risks of transition weren't sufficient to change the direction. I sat down across from her desk. "The pattern seems to target specific ages and specific salary levels." "I'm aware of what the pattern looks like," Rebecca said quietly. "Is it legal?" "I've consulted with legal counsel. They've said it's defensible. That doesn't necessarily mean it's right. That distinction seemed important. Defensible but not right." "Why did you participate if you had concerns?" "Because the alternative was to resign," Rebecca said. "And I have a family. I have financial obligations. I have a career I've invested in. And I was told that my concerns had been noted and the decision was final regardless of my input. So I participated in a decision I had reservations about because the cost of not participating seemed too high. I understood that calculus. I'd made similar calculations throughout my career. Compromises I told myself were pragmatic, moments where I decided that principle was a luxury I couldn't afford. But hearing her articulate it, hearing her explain how she'd sacrificed her moral certainty for her financial security, made something in me aware of how much I'd been sacrificing throughout my life for the same reasons. "Are you okay with what happened?" I asked. "No," Rebecca said, "but I've learned to compartmentalize. I have to, or the job becomes impossible." After I left her office, I understood I'd been looking for something that didn't exist. I'd been searching for someone to blame, some evil actor who'd orchestrated my removal, some conspiracy that I could fight. What I'd actually found was a system working exactly as it was designed to work. Rebecca wasn't a villain. She was a person who'd made pragmatic choices within the constraints of her circumstances. David wasn't a villain either. He was an executive doing what executives do, making decisions based on financial efficiency and shareholder value. The system that had produced my elimination wasn't run by bad people. It was run by people trying to survive within a system that demanded regular sacrifice of inconvenient human elements. Driving home that night, I realized something I should have understood years ago. The system wasn't going to change because I understood it. My understanding wasn't actually important. My continued employment wasn't going to be affected by my clarity about how my own elimination had been decided and executed. I'd spent 6 weeks trying to solve a mystery that had no solution, trying to understand a decision that wasn't actually complicated. I'd been inefficient. They'd decided efficiency required my removal. Both of those things could be true without any additional meaning. That realization should have been liberating, and in some ways it was, but it was also lonely in a way I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in my life, I was being forced to confront the fact that my professional identity, the thing I'd spent my adult life constructing, was not inherently valuable. It was valuable only insofar as it served financial purposes for organizations that were indifferent to my well-being. And without that identity, without the structure and purpose it provided, I had to figure out who I was. I was 52 years old, unemployed for 6 weeks, sitting in a townhouse that belonged to me except for the substantial mortgage I still had to pay. And I had no idea what happened next. Michael called again. "How's the research going on San Francisco?" "I haven't actually started looking," I admitted. "Dad, you need to do something. You can't just sit there." "I know. Come here. Seriously. Take it for a month. If you hate it, you can go back to Baltimore. But at least try something different." He was right. My current approach wasn't working. I was cycling through patterns, research, investigation, obsessive attention to the company I'd left, attempts to assign meaning to my removal, and none of it was moving me forward. It was just giving my brain something to do instead of accepting the reality of what had happened. At some level, I understood that my obsession with understanding my termination was a way of staying connected to the identity I'd lost. If I could figure out why I'd been let go, maybe I could adjust and become the person the system valued again. But what Rebecca had confirmed was that the system's valuation wasn't really about me at all. It was about efficiency algorithms that had decided I was expensive and therefore replaceable. "Okay," I said to Michael. "I'll come in 2 weeks." The decision to change locations, to attempt something new, should have made me feel lighter. Instead, I felt the weight of everything I'd been carrying, the exhaustion, the displacement, the loss of a narrative I'd been telling myself for 23 years. 2 weeks to prepare for a transition I didn't know how to make. I started clearing out my home office, a space I'd rarely used because I'd spent most of my time at the Ashford building. There were files from decades of work, performance reviews dating back to 1995, photographs of company events from when my son was a child. I found a journal I'd kept during my first year as SVP, just entries about meetings and decisions and my thoughts on the restructuring initiatives I'd been working on. Reading my own words from 3 years ago was like reading the words of a different person. I'd been so focused on solving operational problems, on demonstrating my value, on proving that I was indispensable. And it had all been for nothing. Or not nothing. Exactly, it had been for the salary, for the title, for the sense of purpose the job provided. But it turned out purpose was provisional. It turned out dispensability was always lurking underneath the surface of value. I was boxing up the files when I found a photograph from my first week at Ashford Manufacturing. I was 30 years old in the photograph, standing in front of the office building with a woman named Jennifer, who had been my manager back then and who had been promoted repeatedly and was probably still at the company somewhere, older and more experienced and presumably still employed. Jennifer had her arm around my shoulder in the photo, and I was smiling in a way that suggested I believed I'd found my place. 30 years old and convinced that I'd discovered the place where I'd spend the rest of my career. I put the photograph in a box, labeled it Archive, and put it in the storage closet. Then I sat down and called my ex-wife Claire. We hadn't spoken in 4 years except through text messages and emails about logistics involving Michael. She'd moved to Philadelphia after our divorce and remarried to a man named David who seemed to make her happier than I had. When she answered, her voice carried a wary friendliness that suggested this was an unusual occurrence. "Harrison, is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "I just wanted to call and say that I lost my job and I'm moving to San Francisco for a month to see if I can figure out what to do next." "Oh," she said. "I'm sorry. Are you okay?" "Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know yet, but I'm trying to figure it out." "That's good," Claire said, "that you're trying something different. Honestly, you seem miserable in that job. Every time we spoke, you were talking about the company, about work frustrations, about politics. I don't think that position was making you happy." "I know," I said. I didn't realize that until after they fired me. You're going to be okay, Claire said, and her voice carried a certainty that I wished I felt. You're smart, you're capable. You've got good instincts once you stop overthinking everything. You're going to figure this out. We talked for maybe 20 more minutes, and afterward, I realized that Claire's assessment of my situation was probably more accurate than any of my own internal analyses had been. I'd been unhappy. I had been overthinking everything. I had constructed a narrative about being valuable and indispensable, and then I'd constructed an equally detailed narrative about being wronged and discriminated against, when the actual truth was simpler. I'd been in a job that wasn't working for me anymore, and the company had made a business decision to eliminate the position. The meaning I'd been trying to assign to my removal was entirely of my own construction. 2 days before I was supposed to leave for San Francisco, I went to the Ashford building one more time. I parked in the visitor section this time, walked through the lobby as a stranger, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. I didn't go to Rebecca's office or my old office or anywhere specific. I just walked through the space I'd spent the last 23 years inhabiting, trying to see it clearly. The desks looked smaller than I remembered. The office felt less imposing. People I'd worked with for years were there, at their desks, living their daily professional lives, and none of them were thinking about me. I'd been occupying significant mental real estate imagining how much they were thinking about my absence, how much my removal was reshaping their existence. The reality was that I'd been a problem that was solved, a piece that was removed from the puzzle and replaced with something slightly different but fundamentally equivalent. I took the elevator back down without talking to anyone. I walked through the lobby and out to the parking lot. I didn't feel anything dramatically different. I just felt tired. It seemed strange that something that had consumed such a large percentage of my adult life, that had structured my days and my weeks and my years, could be so easy to walk away from once the decision to leave had been made. On the plane to San Francisco, I sat by the window and read a book I'd started months ago but never finished. It was about organizational behavior, about the ways that systems perpetuate themselves and eliminate inconvenient elements. Ironic reading material given my current situation, but I found it oddly comforting to know that what had happened to me was well documented and predictable. My removal wasn't personal or unique. It was part of the normal functioning of large organizations that needed to eliminate institutional memory periodically in order to remain agile and efficient. Michael picked me up at SFO. He'd gotten older since I'd last seen him, which was strange to notice. He was 27, but he looked 30, which suggested he'd already accumulated more adult experience than his years should have contained. Or maybe I was just noticing because I was different now, too hollowed out, reconstructed, uncertain about the narrative I'd been living. You look like shit, Michael said as we drove through the airport. I feel like shit, I said. We'll fix that, he said, but he didn't sound entirely confident. Michael and Sarah's apartment was small but carefully designed, with the kind of thoughtfulness that suggested they'd made intentional decisions about what mattered. Sarah was 6 months pregnant, visibly expanding, and she hugged me like we'd seen each other recently instead of not at all in the last 3 years. She'd made food a kind of pasta situation that was exactly what I needed, but hadn't known I was missing. Michael said, "You've been obsessing about your job," Sarah said over dinner. I have been, I admitted. Do you miss it? I thought about the question carefully. No, I said. I was thinking I would, but I don't. I miss the structure. I miss having a purpose. But I don't miss the actual job itself. That's a good starting point, Sarah said. Michael showed me the spare room where I'd be staying, a small office. Space with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out over the San Francisco skyline. I stood at the window and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't quite peace, exactly, but it was something approximating the beginning of peace. It was a kind of permission to let the past version of myself, the version that had been fighting to understand and control the circumstances of his own removal, begin to settle. Over the next week, I spent time with Michael and Sarah, and I noticed things about them that I'd missed during our years of limited contact. Michael was genuinely happy. He had built a life with someone who he cared about deeply. They were preparing to bring a new human into the world. He was engaged with work that seemed to interest him without consuming him entirely. Looking at him, I could see the ways I'd failed to model balance, the ways I'd shown him that professional identity was worth sacrificing everything for. On my second Friday in San Francisco, Michael took me to visit a tech company where a recruiter friend of his worked. He'd arranged for me to have an informational interview with the company's VP of operations. The VP was younger than me, maybe 40, but she had a thoughtfulness about her that reminded me of myself at that age, before the weight of defending my position had become my primary focus. She asked about my experience and my expertise, and I talked about the last 23 years without any of the defensiveness I'd been carrying. "Why did you leave Ashford?" she asked. "I was terminated," I said. "They decided my position wasn't aligned with their current strategy." "Do you think that was accurate?" she asked. I considered the question seriously. "Partially," I said. "I was expensive and they wanted cheaper. I had accumulated institutional knowledge that they decided wasn't as valuable as agility and cost efficiency. From a business perspective, the decision made sense." "But?" she asked. "But I spent 23 years there and it turned out that I was replaceable," I said, which is something I should have understood intellectually, but didn't understand in any way that actually changed how I was living. The VP laughed. "Well, you're going to keep being replaceable," she said. "That's the fundamental lesson of post-industrial capitalism. Everyone's replaceable. The question is whether that terrifies you or whether you find it liberating." "I'm not sure yet," I said. "Check in with me in a month," she said. "You might know by then." After the interview, Michael and I walked through the city, and I noticed things I'd missed in my previous visit to the Bay Area, the way the light hit the buildings, the diversity of people moving through the streets, the sense that everyone was in the process of building something or rebuilding something, but that failure wasn't treated as apocalyptic. It was just a feature of the landscape, a thing that happened regularly, something you dealt with and moved on from. That evening, I sat in the apartment with Sarah while Michael was at work, and she told me something that Michael probably hadn't wanted me to know. "Michael worries about you," she said. "He's worried you're going to get stuck in the story about being wronged, about how unfair it all was. He thinks you need to move on to the next chapter." "What's the next chapter?" I asked. "I don't know," Sarah said. "But staying in the last one isn't going to work." I spent the rest of my time in San Francisco trying to figure out what the next chapter could look like. I had money, a supportive son, time, and opportunity. I had skills that people seemed to want. I had a life that could theoretically be reconstructed. But I was struggling with the fact that whatever I built next would be based on an understanding that it was all provisional. The identity I'd construct would be disposable. The job I accepted would be a temporary arrangement. The security I attempted to build would be theoretical at best. It was Michael who finally said what I needed to hear. We were sitting on the roof of their apartment building looking at the city, and he said, "Dad, you know that the thing you were trying to build at Ashford, the permanent thing, the thing you thought would last forever, that was never real, right? That kind of permanence doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never existed. You were probably chasing something that was always an illusion. So what's the point?" I asked. "The point is that life doesn't require permanence to be valuable," he said. "You can build something, engage with it fully, contribute to it completely, and then let it go when it's time to let it go. You don't have to be attached to forever. You can just be present with what exists now." He was 27 years old, and he understood something that I'd spent 52 years not understanding. That seemed like a kind of grace. On my last day in San Francisco, I went for a long walk by myself. I crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and walked through the Marin headlands, and I thought about the fact that I'd spent 23 years accumulating expertise in a system that turned out not to care about expertise or longevity. I thought about Rebecca, who'd made compromises I understood. I thought about Thomas and Marcus and the other people I'd worked with, all of them navigating similar systems, making similar calculations, trying to balance principle and pragmatism. I thought about the VP who'd said that everyone is replaceable, which sounded depressing until you understood it as a kind of permission to not take the replaceability personally, permission to understand your professional identity as something you could create and recreate as needed, rather than something you had to defend forever. I called my mother from the headlands. She was 91 and living in Ohio, and she'd been alive through much more professional transformation than I had. She'd watched 3 distinct career revolutions happen, had seen industries rise and fall, had raised 2 children who'd navigated entirely different professional landscapes than she had. "Your job is over," I told her. "Oh, honey," she said. "Is that why you called? Are you okay?" "I think so," I said. "I'm trying to figure out who I am if I'm not that job." "You're the same person you've always been," she said. "You're just not organized around that particular structure anymore. But everything I've been, everything you've been is still inside you," she said. "You're just going to have to figure out how to express it differently." When I got back to Baltimore, I didn't go back to my townhouse immediately. Instead, I drove to the Ashford building and parked in the parking lot for the last time. I sat in my car and felt the weight of 23 years in a way I'd been too close to feel when I was still employed there. It was significant and strange and finished. All the meetings I'd attended, all the decisions I'd made, all the hours I'd spent, it had all accumulated into something, and then that something had been removed, and the system had immediately adapted and continued functioning without me. I understood that my removal wasn't a tragedy. It was a transition. And transitions, I was learning, were just features of life rather than failures of my life specifically. What happened next is the part I wasn't expecting. I took a consulting role with the VP of operations from the tech company I'd interviewed with. It paid more than I'd made at Ashford. It required only 30 hours a week. And it was based in San Francisco, which meant I could rent an apartment near Michael and be part of his life as his child was being born. The security I got was different than what I'd imagined. It was based on specific deliverables rather than the promise of ongoing employment. But paradoxically, it felt more secure because I understood exactly what the terms were and could adjust my life accordingly. I sold my Baltimore townhouse. I moved into an apartment in San Francisco in a neighborhood where I could see Michael's apartment from my fire escape. I hired a therapist and spent months excavating the extent to which I'd confused professional identity with personal identity. I started running in the mornings and actually making it part of my life rather than something I did when I felt like I needed to earn the right to exist. I went to Michael's son's birth and I held a tiny human and understood that I'd spent so much time worrying about my own continuation that I hadn't noticed I was already continuing through someone else. 8 months after my termination from Ashford, I was sitting in a coffee shop near my apartment in San Francisco when I got a message from an old colleague named Jessica who still worked there. She'd left a message on LinkedIn saying she wanted to reconnect. When I called her back, I learned that Ashford was in chaos. The restructuring that had eliminated my position had not gone well. The consulting firm they'd brought in had delivered poor results. The outsourced operations were creating inefficiencies. Institutional knowledge was proving to be more valuable than the company had anticipated. David Rothstein was being blamed for poor strategy, and there were rumors of a board-led restructuring that might include his removal. I felt a flash of something that might have been vindication or might have been schadenfreude, but mostly what I felt was nothing. That company had been my focus for so long, and now it seemed small and irrelevant to my actual life. The fact that my removal had been part of a larger strategic failure was interesting intellectually, but it didn't change anything. I'd still been let go. The decision hadn't been reversed. No one was going to call me and ask me to come back because they'd realized their mistake. What it did do was help me understand something important: the narrative I'd been constructing about being wrongly treated, about being victimized by a system I didn't understand, about being eliminated unfairly. That narrative had been giving me a kind of agency, even if it was the agency of the wronged. Once I accepted that the system had worked exactly as designed, that I hadn't been wronged or treated unfairly but simply eliminated as part of normal business operations, I lost that framework for understanding my displacement. But I also gained access to a different kind of freedom. I could stop trying to make the system make sense and instead just accept that systems are sometimes senseless and that my task was to build a life that didn't depend on the system's coherence. A year after my termination, I was sitting with Michael and Sarah and my new grandson, and Sarah asked me if I regretted the way things had happened. No, I said, which surprised me because I would have expected to feel regret. It turned out to be necessary. Necessary for what? Michael asked. Necessary for me to understand that I'd been living someone else's story instead of my own, I said. That's the thing I didn't expect when I was sitting in my Baltimore townhouse 6 weeks after termination, obsessing over the details of my removal. I didn't expect to discover that losing the job I'd spent 23 years fighting to keep would turn out to be the thing that freed me to actually live instead of just accumulating titles and responsibilities. I didn't expect that the security I'd been trying to build, the permanence, the sense that I'd finally arrived somewhere stable, was actually a kind of trap. I didn't expect that at 52 years old, I'd be beginning to understand what actually mattered instead of what the system had taught me to value. What the system teaches you is that you matter in proportion to your utility, that your value is determined by your ability to generate profit or efficiency, that your permanence is dependent on your continued usefulness. And all of that is mathematically true. But what I learned after losing it all is that mattering in proportion to utility means you don't actually matter at all. What mattered, what has actually mattered my entire life, and what I finally have access to now is the people I love. The work I do because I choose to do it rather than because it's required. The morning runs where I notice the way light hits the buildings, the time I get to spend with my grandson watching him discover his own existence. I was looking for the real treasure, the secret that would make sense of everything I'd sacrificed. The real treasure turned out to be the thing I'd had all along and had been too busy climbing to notice. It was right there next to me the whole time, in the form of a son who worried about me, a grandson who grabs my finger with his entire hand like holding on is the most important thing he knows how to do, a new chapter that I get to write based on what I've learned instead of what the system tells me I should want. I wasted a lot of time and energy trying to understand why I was eliminated from Ashford Manufacturing. I spent months investigating, obsessing, trying to assign meaning to something that was fundamentally about resource allocation and financial efficiency. The waste of that time bothers me less than it used to. What matters now is that I finally stopped fighting to stay in a structure that was designed to eliminate me eventually anyway, and I finally allowed myself to build something different. That different thing is smaller than my old life. It's less prestigious. It pays reasonably well but doesn't create the illusion of security. It's more fragile and more honest. And it turns out that when you stop investing your entire existence in trying to maintain the illusion of permanence, you get to invest it in something real. You get to be fully present for your grandchild learning to smile. You get to mentor junior operations people without being threatened by them. You get to take contracts that interest you and decline ones that don't. You get to admit you don't have to figure everything out because you're 52, and you're never going to have all the answers. I realized the real treasure wasn't hidden. It was just obscured by everything I thought was more important. And losing everything, my job, my identity, my sense of purpose, turned out to be what I needed to finally see it. That seems like the kind of thing I should have understood at 40 or 30 or even at 20. But I understand it now, and that turns out to be enough. Being 52 and finally beginning to know what matters, that's not too late. That's actually just in time.